introduce you to Mrs. Nicole Stott from NASA, and please come on the stage.
Hello.
Good to see you again. We already met last evening, so it's not entirely new, but welcome.
Thank you.
I'm very happy that you are here as our guest of this Speedy Tuesday event in Milan. It's very special. And I heard you were going to share some of your beautiful stories with our guests.
I will.
Good. And I leave the stage to you.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So it is really a pleasure to be here with you all in Milan. Beautiful city. And what better venue than one like this, where we are surrounded by the masterpieces of Leonardo when we're talking about celebrating a real icon in terms of craftsmanship and time as Omega, and celebrating that in parallel with this really wonderful anniversary of the 50th year of Omega and humans on the moon. So I thought today I would share with you a little bit of my experience in space, some of the different aspects of that. I'll start with this slide, which I hope you think is beautiful. This is a picture of my ride home from space, the Space Shuttle Atlantis. And in this one picture, it reminds me of what it was like to be in space. It is really, really beautiful to look at Earth, to see space from space, to just be there. And even though this looks like we are standing still, just hanging there, peacefully, quietly, standing there in space, I know that we're traveling at 17,500 miles an hour, or 5 miles a second, which means we orbit the Earth every 90 minutes, which then means about every 45 minutes or so we get one of these really stunning sunrises or sunsets out the window. I also know that in that little silhouette of a space shuttle that I'm there with my 5 crewmates. We've completed a successful mission and we're on our way home. And I know that my friend Jeff Williams, who I spent several months with on the space station, is still on the space station, and he took this really pretty picture for us. So kind of reminds me what it was like to be in space. I think in all things we start out inspired in some way. You guys are all here today because of the inspiration of, hopefully because of the anniversary of the moon landing, but Omega's place in that, and the creativity that goes behind that, and the things that it's led you to, the friendships you have with the people in this room, the relationships, and the knowledge of these very fine pieces. For me, in terms of inspiration to become an astronaut, ultimately, it started with parents who just shared what they loved with me. One of those main things was a dad who loved to fly and build small airplanes, so I grew up hanging out at the local airport. And as a kid, that passion for flying got in my blood. I eventually figured out that if you want to know how airplanes fly, why would you not want to know how rocket ships fly? And that led me to work at the Kennedy Space Center and on the Space Shuttle program. But I was inspired through somebody sharing what they loved with me, and they were there every step of the way with me, through to watching me launch to space, and then in the airplane as we were coming home after 3 months in space. And it takes a lot of that kind of support to do something like this. This is just a couple pictures from the job I had before astronaut, which at the Kennedy Space Center I got to get really up close and personal with these very complex machines, these space shuttles. And I had the chance to work in pretty much every place that you would work on a space shuttle, in the hangar after they got back from their mission, out at the launch pad, in the launch control center, and here you can see with the team out on the runway after landing to get the vehicle back to the hangar to get it ready to launch again. And I loved working there because these people that you see here, they honestly believed that the care and feeding of these spacecraft was their job. So in the end, when I ultimately got to fly on one, I felt really comfortable about that because of the relationship I'd established with these people and the work that I know they did. And then this is just a fun picture of getting to fly upside down in a T-38 trainer jet, which I always wanted to do. Somehow, and I I say, honestly, by the act of God in some way. I was selected into the class of 2000 of NASA astronauts. There are 17 of us in this picture. This, you can tell, is our official NASA photo that they released to the public, right? We were selected in the year 2000. So some of you might remember, in the year 2000, there was this whole idea that of this Millennium Bug. You know, as we rolled from 1999 to 2000, all those zeros, the computers were going to crash and life was going to end as we know it. And so the class before us, who named us, called us the Bugs. And they thought that was funny because, you know, crashing computers and things and life ending as we know it. We loved the name because most bugs have wings, which means they get to fly, which means, you know, as astronauts, what do you want to do but fly? And we liked it because it wasn't maggots or flying escargot or sardines or penguins or a name like that, which some of the earlier classes had. We thought we got it good. But I show you this picture because I think it's interesting that even as astronauts, there's not one path to anything. We all got to this place in very different ways. And I think that's really wonderful when you think about a mix of crewmates flying to space together or working on the ground together. There's medical doctors and fighter pilots and engineers and oceanographers and submariners and biologists in this picture. And then there's people who are race car drivers and artists and chefs and rock climbers in this picture. And it really makes for a nice group of people to work with, whether you're on the ground or in space. This picture I show you because I think it's just beautiful. I think it is the most beautiful picture that has ever been taken of a space shuttle as it was rolling from that ginormous vehicle assembly building out to the launch pad. And it was taken by a Kennedy Space Center photographer. And this was before my second flight, which was on the final flight of the Space Shuttle Discovery. And I love it because it is just gorgeous. But I think there's kind of an artistic message in it, and I will just tell you, I look at this watch on my arm and I feel the same way. There is this almost simple beauty about it. But anywhere you look in that picture, I don't care if it's the tip of the orange tank or one of the treads on the crawler, there's complexity in it that's almost unimaginable. That somehow as human beings we come together and we can create something like this that safely launches us to space and brings us back home. In preparation for going to live in space, we do a lot of things. Most of it's based on working as a team. How do you learn to work as a crew together? The best place that I had the chance to do that, for sure, was getting to live underwater for 3 weeks as an aquanaut and experiencing our planet from what we call inner space. And so lived for 3 weeks on this habitat called Aquarius that's about the size of a school bus. And it is absolutely the closest thing to living and working in space. You're in an extreme environment, something happens at 60 feet underwater, your body is so saturated with nitrogen that you can't safely swim to the surface to get out of there to solve your problem. You have to deal with it at 60 feet underwater, just like we have to do in space. And then one day, after all the training, so we do training like going underwater. We're in a lot of simulators. We're in those T-38 jets. We're in a pool, you know, with the big suit on, learning how to do spacewalks. We're in a classroom, learning to speak Russian, the most difficult thing I had to do to become an astronaut, and learning about all the systems on the spacecraft. And then one day you get to launch. I don't think anything prepares you for what this is going to feel like. We get out to the launch pad a couple hours before launch and get all strapped in and comfortable and get all of our equipment set, and most of us will nap for a little while before it gets to the point, like 20 minutes before launch, where the crew has a real role in the countdown. But it isn't until that 10, 9, 8 point, kind of that classic, you know, countdown part where you really kind of wake up and think, wow, I might actually go to space today. And on the space shuttle, at 6 seconds, that big orange tank, that was just a big fuel tank for those 3 engines on the bottom of the orbiter. And it contained liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. And at 6 seconds in that countdown, all of that fuel, like bathtubs, pools full of it, started flowing to those 3 engines. And I always thought that would be really, I mean, kind of a violent, you know, dynamic thing to have happen. And it really wasn't. I remember feeling like this little rumble, and you could hear a little bit of sound, but the thing you noticed was the whole space shuttle on the pad would kind of tilt. Like it tilted like 10 feet and then came back up straight at 0. And that's when those 2 solid rocket boosters on the side lit at 0, like perfectly timed. And it's like you're kicked from behind, it's like 3 of you start calling on top of you, and you're shaking like you can't imagine your body could ever shake, like jello inside, and you wonder if you were ever on a launch pad. And you just know you are going someplace really super fast, and you hope it's the right direction. So you're monitoring all these displays to reassure yourself that you're going the right way. And it was funny because in the first 90 seconds of launch off the pad, there wasn't a whole lot that the crew could actively do but monitor the systems. The ground had all the control then. And I think from a human standpoint, that was a really good thing. Because in those first 90 seconds that go by so fast, almost like you can't remember them happening, your body responds in a way that you're smiling, like the biggest smile you ever could imagine. Your hand is reaching out to high five, you know, your crewmate sitting next to you. There's a woohoo that comes out, like woohoo, you know, because you don't want to be unprofessional and like really scream out woohoo. So it's kind of this. And then you get past that and move on to the rest of launch, which 2.5 minutes, those boosters separate, big flash, big bang. 8.5 minutes, the orange tank separates, and from 0 to 8.5 minutes, you've gone from 0 to 17,500 miles an hour, and you are floating in space. It is just incredible. Where we go and where I went both times was to this International Space Station. I would say masterpiece in space. The best example of living off the grid is right here. And it was built in cooperation by 15 different countries, who to this day, over 20 years later, are still working peacefully and successfully together as a unified crew of 6 on the station and as tens of thousands of people across the planet doing the same to make sure that it operates like it's supposed to. I could talk all day about this, but we'll move on. All right, so we built that space station in space, right? We built it as a life support system, really. We discovered how mechanically we could essentially mimic what Earth does for us naturally. You know, providing us with clean air and water, keeping the CO2 levels right inside the station so we could breathe and not get major headaches or die, do science up there, all of that. And we do it so people can live and work there. These were the guys that I spent my 3 months with on the International Space Station. Normally we have a crew of 6. There are 9 people in this picture because we had an overlap. So one of the Soyuz with 3 crew members got there before one of the other ones went home. It was really great with these guys. I show this picture because I think what you guys are experiencing here today, what all of you come together for, is that you enjoy this thing that you share in common, this thing that you love. But you also know that I think you know that you'd have each other's backs. You'd help each other with a problem that you had. And that is exactly how I felt in space with these people, is that I was going to enjoy myself there. We all did. There was personality. I don't know, maybe we had these red noses on. I don't know if you noticed them, but these clown noses. But there's personality in this picture, but there's also professionals. And you know when it hits the fan, when it does, that you will have each other's back and you will support each other to get through it in whatever way is humanly possible. And I'll just tell you, the clown noses in this picture, the gentleman second from the left on the front row, Guy Laliberté, he's the founder, owner of Cirque du Soleil, and he was able to fly for 10 days, I think, on the station with us in one of the crew rotations as what we call a spaceflight participant, or you might know as a space tourist. And it was just wonderful having him on board with us. But he considered himself a clown, and so he brought the clown noses with him for us to share. We go to space to do science. You know, we're working there. Every day is a little bit different. Our day is very regimented. You are working by using this thing on your arm, this watch, and the schedule that's presented to you on the computer. You know, they schedule us down to like 5-minute increments. A bulk of the work is the science that we're doing on station. The reason we do science on the space station is because we can take gravity out of the equation. And when you take gravity out of the equation, kind of interesting things happen, and you can learn stuff about things you thought you already knew a whole lot about, and you see it presented to you in a totally new way. We are the experiment, So every day somebody is wired up with something. You know, do you still have a brain? Do you got a heart? Is it working? You know, how's space affecting it? I learned to draw my own blood because pretty much once a week they wanted my blood, and everything else I could provide them, frozen and sent to the ground to study. I really enjoyed the plant experiments we had. It was a little bit kind of science fairy, but we were learning things about how we would sustain ourselves when we live off Earth, and also how we can improve things here on Earth. And the combustion chamber, that's the parts of it out on the outside of the chamber itself, and every day burning these mixtures of fuels to see how they could be burned more efficiently or pollute less for both traveling further out in space as well as how we could use them here on Earth. This is just a picture to show you that if an astronaut is not doing work, this is where they are. They are in front of the window appreciating this view of Earth out the window. And it is stunning. And I found, and I've told this story before, that if I went to that window during the day, one of the greatest uses of my watch, my Omega watch that I had on station with me, was as a timer and as an alarm. Because if I looked out that window, I would be there for 90 minutes, a full rotation of the Earth, and they'd be calling me on the, you know, on the system saying, Nicole, where are you? We need you to actually work while you're here in space. And so I would set this alarm to remind me to go back to work. And I can tell you that view absolutely sucks you in. We've got a lot of instrumentation on board the space station and on board the space shuttle. It seems like anywhere you go in any of these spacecraft, you're surrounded by it. And that includes, you know, the watch, but it includes cameras and the way we control things around us. All of the work that we're doing is somehow associated with managing our time and space. Every day is a mix of something a little bit different, but like I said before, we are regimented in a way that's like down to this 5-minute, you know, this 5-minute chunk of time. And that becomes very important when, you know, when you're living there. And then when you do get to have a little fun, when you're in space for 3 months or more at a time, you're gonna cross over holidays. I happen to cross Halloween. And as a crew, we scavenged up stuff from around the space station to make our Halloween costumes, and we had a contest with the folks on the ground, and it was one of the funniest days in space. I have my ballet skirt was made from a thermal cover that came on one of the cargo vehicles that we had to remove. Maxime is up at the top with his ray gun. That's like an old piece of a pump that came out of the Russian segment. And then this is my obligatory, I got to do a spacewalk picture, which, to describe space in 2 words, it's awesome and surreal. Those 2 words perfectly fit it. This is I think, the most surrealist of anything you can do in space. To go out in your own little spaceship and crawl around the outside of the space station and to be moving. At one point I got to hold at the end of the arm, the robotic arm, as I was moved from the top of the station down to the payload bay of the shuttle, a box that on the ground would weigh almost 1,000 pounds. But up there, I could just move it around without any effort at all. But I also show this picture because it's the one that my mom reminds me of why she was afraid while I was in space. Because to her, she looks at that and all she sees is this black all around me. And she says to me, she goes, you know, NASA should have a 2 hands on the space station rule at all times. And I'm like, Mom, I got tethers. You know, you're hooked on with these tethers and things too, but that doesn't make it better for your mom. So I'll transition a little bit. You know, one of the greatest things about being in space is the opportunity to appreciate Earth from space, to see the planet in a whole new way. This is one of my favorite pictures because it reminds me I actually got to do that. And when I got to space, I wanted to see Florida from space. I considered Florida to be my home, so when I knew it was out the window, I wanted my face in front of the window. And it was equally as stunning from space as it is from here down on Earth. Getting your brain wrapped around the things you see. This is my crewmate Al crawling along the bottom of the space station. That's the blue kind of glow of Earth. And at first when you look at that, you're like, oh my gosh, why isn't Al falling? And then your brain figures it out and never asks you that again. And you realize that Al feels like he's just crawling along the floor, has no sense of up or down. The beauty of the station against the backdrop of the Earth. Geography lesson, no place better than looking out the window from a space station with your zoom lens to get to know the Earth a little better. Also, if I can make the pointer work, I'll show you a couple pyramids in the picture. We would challenge each other to find what we knew was supposed to be out the window. And then I found it went from looking for the familiar, the geography lesson, to just appreciating being surprised by what you would see. And there are things like this all over the planet to discover, and I think we're meant to discover them. And when I saw this, I really remember thinking, wow, God must have a wonderful sense of humor. Because these things are out there. This is a little naturally shaped hard island in the Red Sea called Dahul. And this is a small area of salt lake called Lake Eyre in Australia. To me, it looks like a George O'Keeffe painting, a big, pink flower. And this was one of my very favorite pictures that I took from space. And these are with big zoom lenses. In space you can carry around that big zoom lens. It's like this big that you need the tripod for. Down here you just, can use it all the time. So probably an 800 or 1,000 millimeter lens to find this little chain of islands that looks like somebody took a brush and painted a wave on the ocean. And this is a little chain of islands called Las Rocas on the northern coast of Venezuela. And that one picture was the inspiration for me to paint this watercolor that I did in space. I brought up a little watercolor kit with me, was able to paint while I was there. Doesn't look quite as beautiful as the wave through the window, but it was a lot of fun to do. I can tell you painting with watercolors in space is a little bit different than down here on Earth. And I'm really happy to say that that painting is now on display at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., if you ever get there to go check it out. And that art that I did in space has led me to bringing, after retiring from NASA, to bringing really the two things I love the most, besides my son, bringing space and art together. And doing that through my own artwork and trying to share the experience I had in space, but also working with kids around the world who are in pediatric cancer centers or some in refugee camps or in places where you hope that you can give them some thought of the future in a positive way. And I can tell you, painting spacesuits with kids does that for them. They think about their future, they talk about going to space, and then they see these spacesuits in space, and it inspires them even more. We've had the opportunity to get a couple of them up to the space station and back, and do video conferences with the kids while the suit is up there, and it's pretty cool to see how something like space can really get kids thinking outside of what they're going through at that time. So I come back to Florida from space. Again, we have Florida in this picture, this time just up in the corner with the keys kind of curving around, and this beautiful, this beautiful, thin blue line of our atmosphere and the planet. And just to tell you that I got to space with Florida as my home. I left space with Earth as my home, and Florida as a special part of this planet. And here's a picture of where we are today. I don't know if I could pick out in particular, but this is Milan from space, a recent photo of Milan from space. And I think, you look at Florida and you see all the blues and the turquoises, and every spot on the planet has its own kind of color code to it. And I think this is just gorgeous with the greens and the turquoises and the copper colors just all coming together so that you would know, again, if you looked at this picture, that this was Milan. And then stepping out a little bit further, just to kind of bring it eventually back to Earth, we go out to these places. We've been sending robotic missions out further and further into our solar system for years. This is one of the classic images from a recent flight of the spacecraft Cassini to Saturn, and we've learned all kinds of really cool things about Saturn from this mission. But the most impressive picture to us always is the one that we're in, kind of the space selfies, I guess. And in this picture, this is us. So we always want to see ourselves in these images. We've had some more recent pictures like this where, a Falcon 9 sends, a big Falcon Heavy sends this red sports, Tesla Sportster to space with Starman in there, very heavy metal kind of thing. But I think what it did was it again allowed us to reflect on this whole idea of who we are and where we are in space together. And there's no better picture than that, I don't think, than the iconic image from the Apollo 8 mission 50 years ago in December, where for the first time with human eyes, shared with us through, the photos, was this picture of Earth, our planet, rising above the horizon of another planetary body. And that, I think, was the greatest reality check for humanity, was for us all to know that we are all already flying together in space, all right there, except for those 3 guys that were out on the moon. And it brings me back to what I learned from flying in space. And while we do all of these complex things, building space stations, the relationships that we work out, in the end, for me, it came back to 3 things that we know intellectually, but I believe we need to incorporate just on a daily basis into our, our conscious daily lives, is that we live on a planet, we're all Earthlings, and the only border that matters is that thin blue line of atmosphere that blankets us all. So I hope if you don't remember anything else I said today, you'll remember those 3 things and you'll carry them with you from here on out and leave here as Earthlings. Thank you.